Please welcome Daniel Afonso.
So let's give it a couple seconds to do the setup real quick. Let's see. Just plugging in, let's see if it works. See? Oh, no, it's done. Not awkward anymore. So, hello CDJS, how is everyone doing? Okay, so first things first, before starting my talk, I'd like to thank once again CDJS for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to all of you. So I would like to start my presentation with a question here, which is, who here likes testing? Likes to write tests? Exactly. Okay, yeah, so I see a few hands raised. I can tell you that 4 years ago, I also didn't like testing. I was the type of person that every time someone said, okay, we need to write tests, I would just try to go to the other room or stay like, can't anyone else do it? It's not my thing. But yeah, one day everything changed for me. One day I stopped being the guy that every time someone mentioned testing, I wanted to run to the other room. And I started being the testing guy at my company. I started being pretty much the person that everyone in my team and in my office, if they had to learn how to test in the front end, they wanted to learn more about testing, they would reach out to me. And all it took was one change, to be honest. And that change was called the one with hooks. So when React hooks came out, a lot of stuff changed, at least in the React world. At least we no longer had class components, or we had them, but we were not incentivized to use them. But hooks had a new paradigm. Now we were writing functional components. We had new ways to manage state. We had new ways to do things that we were used to do in a different way in the past. So me and my team decided to do the migration. We hopped on the hype train and let's rewrite our entire code base and get out of class components. And let's just go on with hooks. And so we did, to be honest. And until someone remembered, I've checked the tests, and pretty much more than half of our tests were failing. So you could probably imagine that this was a reaction of everyone in the room. This was one of the things that prompted us to having Slack discussions for hours, going on in meetings and sharing about stuff like this. So tests are down, time to freak out. Everything is failing here, another coworker said. What happened? Should we revert? And to be honest, at the end of the day, this was the conclusion that I came at the moment, which was that React hooks broke my tests. So now what? So before going on the rest of the story, let me just start by giving you a quick introduction. I'm the person on the right, in case you don't notice the difference. The other one is my pair programming buddy. I am Daniel Afonso. I'm a developer advocate at OLX Group. I'm an Eged.io instructor, an Outsider ambassador, and a soon-to-be published author of State Management with React Query, which also has a section about testing, which is going to be super cool. And you can find me on Twitter and pretty much any social handle at Daniel JC Afonso. So after the introduction, let's get back to what we had and what we had. The thing is, we were not used to the way that we were testing. Most of us in my team, in the front-end team at the company I was working at that time, came from a back-end background. And we weren't testing in the back-end way. We were testing like, okay, we have a function, we have a class, we have something, we instantiate it, we test the implementation of how stuff works. And don't get me wrong, that works for that scenario. But this led to patterns in our tests that were not the ones we wanted. For instance, just recap this UI. This is a searching component that we have instant virtual, which is one of the products from OLX. And we had behavior here, which was, okay, we had a couple of components, we had a couple of tabs to change the way they search. We had a child component, which was the advanced search, so we wanted to get more details. And the way we were testing this before was with stuff like this. So first things first, we were shallow rendering everything because, well, we don't want to be rendering everything. We want only to render the shallow part of our component, which means I'm going to render part of it. I'm not going to render the component children. Then the other thing we were doing is, oh, let's just find everything by the component name. That's the tool allowed us to do that, so why not? Another thing, we used the React props to change tabs. So let's access the props directory of the component and see what happens and manipulate them directly. And then the other thing was we were accessing the component state. And because of this, when we got out of class components and moved to hooks, everything broke. First things first, because at the time, Enzyme was not supporting accessing state in tests in functional components. That was one of the first things. So that's like most of the tests broke because of that. But this made us stink, to be honest, because everything was still working the same way it did before. We didn't change the logic, we didn't change the business logic, we didn't change the UI logic. Everything was exactly the same. The only thing was different was the internal way that we built it, was the code. And we didn't know what to do, to be honest. We were quite in a pickle during a couple of weeks, researching, figure out what to do, like, should we delete the tests? Should we just go on without tests in our component? But, well, we like to sleep well at night. So we had to figure out another way. And with that research, we found out something, which was testing implementation details. So that was what we had in our tests. Everything that we saw here, from state, from props, to do the components names, are the implementation details of how we built our components. Now, you might be wondering, what are implementation details? So as someone that's around this conference somewhere says on one of his blog posts, implementation details are the things which the users of your code will not typically use, see, or even know about. So once again, putting in perspective, component props, component state, the way that we rendered our components, the components that we were using, they are all implementation details. And this led to us having the need to find a difference on how we were testing. Because it was clear from that point that implementation details were not something that we really wanted to continue following. And we wanted to find a new way, something new, something different, something that, well, made us all be able to sleep better at night. Because at the end of the day, that's why we write tests, is to make sure that everything works and we don't get woken up at 2 or 3 a.m. because production is burning. So this led to a testing shift, and this testing shift meant we didn't care anymore about implementation details. We wanted to learn something new. We wanted to test our components the way that the user used them. So this meant trying to follow something that's called the user-centric approach. And what this means from the user-centric approach, it meant that, first things first, no more shallow rendering, because when the user interacts with your component, the user interacts with your component in its entirety. The user doesn't care if you're hiding the children or not, because they are there. The user is interacting with them. So in a user-centric perspective, let's render everything. Another thing, search like the user. The user doesn't know what are the component names. The user doesn't know what props do you have. He doesn't know anything. So let's follow an approach that you can query for stuff on your UI the same way that the user looks for them. Once again, instead of checking props, just assert that you're on the right tab. You do not need to mutate them. You just click on it, and somehow there's going to be an indication. Right now here, there's an indication that we are on the cards tab. And the other thing here is the data on the dropdown. So what I mean by this is, instead of checking what's the state of your dropdown, well, just check what's actually visible there, because that's what your user sees when he interacts with your stuff. So during this process, and from following a user-centric approach, we found this tweet, once again by someone that's around this conference, that says, the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. And this is actually the tweet that represents the philosophy of something called the testing library. So for those of you who are not aware, a testing library is a set of tools built upon a base library, which is called the DOM testing library. And from there, you have a bunch of them. You have React, you have Svelte, you have Vue, you have Angular. And with all these frameworks and all these versions, we were actually using React. With all these things, well, we have something that we can use. We can finally get out of the tool that we were using at the time, which was Enzyme. Don't get me wrong, Enzyme is great. The thing is, if you're not careful with how you leverage your functionalities and your functions, you will end up finding yourself testing implementation details, even if accidentally. And the testing library, the main purpose is focus on a user-centric approach. You don't care anymore about the implementation details. So what we're going to see now is pretty much, I have 15 minutes. In 10 minutes, I'll show you everything that you need to know about the testing library, so you can take it for any testing library. So after this, you can leverage this on Angular, Svelte, React, whatever. Just a disclaimer, the templates and the code snippets we're going to see are in React, but I'll explain them, so hopefully we'll be OK. So there are 3 fundamentals that you need for the testing library. First one is querying. Second one is how you fire events. And the third one is some extra utils, which I'll explain later. So starting with the querying. There are a couple of ways that you can query for stuff on the UI. There are three ones, starting with query by. So query by is a variant of queries that it will try to look for on your UI for something that matches the next expression. So there's an asterisk there because you can append something that we'll see later. But it will try to find what you're looking for. So imagine, oh, I want to find for this button. If it finds it, it will return it so you can use it for the next step of your test. If it doesn't find it, it will return null. On the other hand, there's a get by variant, which when it finds what you're looking for, it will also return it. So it's very similar with query by. But the difference is, if it doesn't find it, it will throw an exception. Your tests will fail. So now, one question that might pop up is, when should I use query by and when should I use get by? Well, query by variants are useful when you want to assert that something doesn't exist. While the get by is, okay, if it will fail when something doesn't exist, you obviously want to use it to assert that something is there. Another thing that's important to mention is that both these versions of queries are synchronous. So it searches, it finds, it returns. But if somehow, imagine that you clicked on a button and you need to wait for a spinner to show up or another thing to show up. In that scenario, you're going to have to do some waiting. So in this scenario, you need an asynchronous variant. And this is when find by comes in. So with find by, you just do find by, do the query, wait for it, and once the promise resolves, it will return your data. One thing to be aware here is that this variant will only return one single instance. So if you need an array of these things, of elements, I mean, you have to use the all by variant. So query all by, get all by, find all by, it will return an array of the things that you want to search for. Now, like I said, there's an asterisk there for some reason, because these queries can be appended by different ways to search for stuff on your UI. So there are 4 families in query variants. The first one is the queries that are accessible to everyone. So these are the queries that fully represent the user experience. So when I mean fully represent, it means if you have users using assistive technology, screen readers, whatever, these queries will match the experience of a user that doesn't have the need for these type of things, as well as the user who has. If for any reason these queries don't work, you have semantic queries. The semantic queries make use of HTML5 and ARIA compliant selectors, like, for instance, as title and I forgot what we'll see next, sorry. Then we have test IDs. Now, we have to start being careful when we start thinking about test IDs, because these are the closest thing we have to implementation details. But it's a controlled implementation detail. So the test ID queries is pretty much when you add the test ID attribute to your elements. So you can query by that specific test ID, but these can be a sort of an escape hatch, so you should try to avoid them. But there's another consideration about it, but we'll talk about it later. And finally, the manual queries. So this is another type of query. It's not the same as the 3 we saw before, but once again, without spoilers, we'll see it next. So the order, how you should start to query stuff on a DOM. You should always start by the queries that are accessible to everyone, because that's one of the greatest things that I like about the testing library, is that it promotes accessibility by itself. So by focusing on the queries and starting always on the accessibles to everyone, for me personally, I found like a bunch of accessibility issues in my components, in the components of the design systems of the companies that I've worked, all just because I've always had in mind following with queries accessible to everyone. So the queries that are accessible to everyone are the label text, the placeholder, the role, the display value, and the text. So the way this works is, let's just look at the example we have there. So we have a label, and we have an input. That label is associated to that input by the ID, and by the area labeled by attributes. So how does this work if we want to get this input in the testing library? Well, before going to the testing library, let's think like the user. A user sees an input. How does he interact with it? First things first, he reads the label. Okay, this is the label, so this is the input. I'm going to start writing or do whatever I want in here. So this is the same way it acts with the testing library. First things first, you need to render your component. One thing that I didn't mention, because this is not something that's transversal to all testing libraries, but each one of them has a version of how you can render your components. So when you render a component, you will render them into a sort of a virtual DOM where you can interact with it and write your tests. So you render a component. In this scenario, you're rendering the my component, and you destructure your query. We are destructuring a get by variant with the label text part of it. So what we're trying to find is something that matches that label text, and if it finds it, okay, cool, your test will continue. If it doesn't find it, it will throw an error. So how does this work? When you call get by label text with the username, it will walk into your HTML and see, is there any label here that says username? And it will find the one in the top. If it does, and if it has an ID, it will check, is this ID associated with anything? And it will check immediately that there's an input that has the area labeled by username label. So it will have the same ID, so it will return this input so that you can do whatever you want with it on the firing, on the asserting part of it. And this is a query accessible to everyone. Going to the semantic queries, oh, it was the alt text, I forgot earlier on. So the alt text and the by title. The thing is with these queries that you have to be aware is that you start losing accessibility on a couple of things. Because for instances, the title attribute is not consistently read across screen readers. So there might be an issue, and this is why you should use this one in the second resort. So always start with the accessible to everyone. An example of how it works, we have a span. That span has a title delete, and to query for it, we are using a get by variant, get by title, and it will try to find something that has the delete title in it. And once again, it will find the span and return it. Continuing, test IDs. Now, it's only the by test ID query, and we have to be, once again, careful. I know that for some teams, especially in the teams that I worked in the past, there have been scenarios that the QA team asked me to start adding test IDs there. You can add them, but when you start writing your tests, don't use them. Sometimes, because you'll start forgetting stuff, you'll start doing hacks, and once you get to a point that you do the first one, you'll just continue putting them everywhere, and you'll forget accessibility, you forget all the advantages that it brings you. So how it works, you add your test ID to your component. For instance, scenario, imagine that we have a div that is always changing, and all the other queries don't match there because the content there is constantly changing. And this is the scenario that probably you will need to resort to a test ID. You add your test ID, you use the get by test ID query the stuff, and once again, you have the thing that you want. Finally, to wrap up querying, the manual queries. So this is not an actual query that belongs to the testing library ecosystem. It's pretty much the query selector API from the DOM API, actually. So instead of using queries, you can access directly the container where your component is rendered and query by a selector. Now, if test IDs are implementation details, these are even bigger implementation details, and it's a bigger escape hatch. Personally, I only had in over 4 years using the testing library, I only had the need of using this like one time, and it was in a scenario that was a library that was completely out of my control and I couldn't change anything there. So don't use this unless the world is about to end or something like that. So now we know querying, but one thing that people sometimes struggle with, okay, should I use accessible to everyone? Should I use test IDs? Should I use manual queries? How do I choose? Once again, start from the top to the bottom. But if you're still struggling, here's something that was released a couple years ago that started helping, which is called the testing playground. So pretty much what you can do is you just copy your HTML, post it there, and for instance, if I want to get the query that I need to find that email address, you click on it and it will tell you, oh, you want to use a get by role query, which is a query that belongs to the queries accessible to everyone. So it will always try to prioritize accessibility first. This is super useful. And there is also a way inside of the code to get a link with all your code there, but we'll go there in a bit. So real quick, we know querying, now firing events. There are two ways to fire events in the testing library ecosystem. The first one is the fire event object. So pretty much what you do is fire event dot the type of event that you want to do, and it will fire a single event. Now, there's a consideration with firing a single event, which is when a user interacts with the UI, for instance, as a button, it's not just an event that's fired. So there's the on mouse over, on mouse down, the click event. There are a bunch of things that are fired there. So to fix this issue and to having a more close to the user experience, the user event library was created. So with the user event library, you'll pretty much use it the same way. There's the only difference is since version 14, just to be clear, since version 14, it's asynchronous. Before that, you didn't have to wait and you can do everything you wanted with it. But it will fire all the events associated with clicking there. So the suggestion is always go with the user event. Once I started going with the user event library, I didn't think I had any need to go with fire event, because once again, user experience and the way that they use the stuff. Okay, so going to the utils. There are a couple utils that I want to show you. The first one is a wait for. So when you're writing a test, let's imagine that we are following the AAA pattern, which is arrange, act, and assert. When you get to the assert part, sometimes you want to assert for something that hadn't happened yet. So in this scenario, what you can leverage is the wait for util. So pretty much, it's an asynchronous function that will loop the code inside of it until the assertion passes. So you wait for, in this scenario, something that happened, and when this assertion evaluates to true, your test will complete. If you want to wait for something to disappear because you know how to wait for something to appear, which is using a find by query, if you want to wait something to disappear, you can use the wait for element to be removed, so you just pass it your element, and it will wait until it disappears from your DOM. Some quick utils, screen object, so this is something that pretty much has the reference to your entire container where your components is rendered. So pretty much what happens here was that previously, if you wanted to render, you had to destructure the queries from it. With screen, you have everything pre-bind there, so you can just get by query, whatever. One super util thing that screen has, and I don't think it's super documented or talked about, is you can do screen.log testing playground, and it will give you a link for the testing playground with everything that you are rendering in your component. So you can also find a ways to interact with your queries, figure out what you want to use because of the screen object. So if somehow you want to find out how your DOM looks, you can use the debug util. And if you want to query inside of, for instance, a div, let's give an example. You have two buttons that have the same name. In this scenario, you can just get a part of where that button is and say, inside of this div, I want to find only this button. And it will allow you to query within specific things. So we've seen pretty much now you know everything that you need to use the testing library. So in about 2 minutes, I'll try to show you everything that me, my team, and some people that I've worked with did wrong while using the testing library. So this is a more React-focused thing, but for those of you who are not aware, when you're performing activities that are units of interaction with the user interface, you need to make sure that they are flushed to the UI before continuing your test. So that's what act is for. So if you're rendering, if you're firing events, you are interacting with your UI. So act is there to make sure that once you do that, your test is okay and you can continue. The thing is, if you're using, for instance, the React testing library, you don't need it, because the React testing library automatically wraps everything with act. So I never had a use case that I had to use act. There's an issue that I'll show you at the end, because that's when most of people start resorting to act. But the point that I want to leave here is if you're using the React testing library, you don't need act anywhere. Using get by with expect not to be in the document. So the expect not to be in the document is an assertion that belongs to the Jest DOM library. And it pretty much asserts that something is or isn't on the DOM. Now, if you remember when I spoke about querying, the get by query will throw an error when it doesn't find what you're looking for. So doing this is asking for your test to fail. So what you need here is a query by variant instead. Using a wait with fire event or non-asynchronous queries. So this is not that anti-pattern, but it's something that happens sometimes. You don't need to wait for get by role or by fire event. Now with user event you need, but for fire event object you don't. So instead just remove it, or if you want to wait for something to appear specifically for querying, go with the find by object. Using a wait with wait for. So if you remember when I talked about wait for, it will loop the code inside of it until the expression evaluates. Now, this might seem weird, but I've seen it happen more times than I'd like. Some people just put the wait for it, will wait for an empty object. So what this will do is, we'll wait for your next tick of your test, and when you get your assertion, it might pass or might not. So What you should do here is pass your assertion inside of the wait for. Using cleanup. So cleanup pretty much will clean up your UI after you write a test. So it might be a good pattern to, okay, let's clean everything up. The thing is, if you're using a framework that supports the after each global, it runs automatically for you, so that's super neat. Just wrapping up, the wait for with synchronous queries. So sometimes people that might say, oh, I'm going to use the wait for and wait for this query to pass. The thing is, why are you waiting for something when you have a specific query to do that? So just leverage the find by variant. And the final mistake is using side effects inside of the wait for. So in this scenario, we are firing a click event inside of a wait for. But if you remember, wait for will loop the code inside of it until the assertion, which is that expect there, passes. So if it doesn't pass the first time, it will keep clicking. So this might have unnecessary effects on your tests that you don't want to happen. So instead, remove the events firing from your wait for and only leave your assertions there. Here's something that's really helpful in this scenario. The SWIN plugin testing library will help you find pretty much of those anti-patterns, and it keeps getting better and better. So if you're not using it yet, I super recommend it. And finally, I know I run out of time, but I'll try to do this in 1 minute because this is the most important part in the React ecosystem when using the testing library, which is the was not wrapped in act error. So remember when I spoke about the act, remember when I spoke about the mistake of using the wait for with the empty callback? These are all hacks that I've seen people use to fix this issue. So pretty much what we see here is there was an update inside of our component, and okay, this is a unit of interaction with the UI, so we need to use act to make sure that is flushed to the UI before continuing. But remember, I told you, you don't need to use it anywhere. So let's review this component real quick. We have a component here that's called display Pokemon. This component receives a get Pokemon data function, which is responsible for doing some data fetching. And then it calls a function that will be responsible, first things first, for setting a loader to true, then fetching your data, and once the data is fetched, setting the loader to false. Then you just render, and then you have a button to click there and display the loading. Now, if I would write a test for this, I would probably think, okay, let's first things first, mock the get Pokemon data, because this is a prop and we want to make sure it was called, or it was called with the right data. We render our component, and then we click on the button that will trigger the data fetching. And then we assert that if the button was clicked with the get Pokemon data. The thing is, if we run this test, there it is, the feared error and the thing that has took me hours of sleep a couple of years ago. And it doesn't make it super clear, to be honest. But let's review what's happening that we forgot. We forgot that in our test, after we do the data fetching, we are setting our loader to false. So pretty much what this warning here is telling us is, hey, look, you forgot to check for something in your test. So this is React's way, even if not super clear, to telling you, you forgot something. So you need to add this in your test. So how do we fix this? Pretty much just add an assertion to check if loading has appeared or disappeared from your test after doing data fetching. And after this, the error is gone. So with that, and now finally wrapping out, yeah, 4 years ago I didn't like testing, to be honest, and the testing library changed a lot over the years. And some people might argue that, yeah, I prefer to write tests in X, Y, Z, I like enzyme, I like shallow rendering. This is not a real unit test, it's not a real integration test. To that, I like to say, use what makes you sleep better at night, because that's always been my perspective. That's the thing that the testing library always brought to me. It brought me safety, it brought me a user-centric approach that made me sure that even if we changed the implementation, but the behavior kept the same, if the user kept interacting with our stuff in the same way, everything would be okay. Because at the end of the day, React hooks didn't break my tests. Implementation details did. So with that, I want to thank everyone and give it up back to Sarah so she can introduce the next speaker. Thank you.